Before we get started, can everybody hear us? If you can, could you please type in the chat box that you can hear us? Because we haven't. Okay, people can hear us. Okay. So I see that one person. Okay, great. Perfect. Okay, we wanted to do that sound check really quick to make sure that our mute button was off. And I also want to let you know that if you can see us in video, that's great. You can join us by video. And if you can't see us, that's okay too. We'll be turning off the video when Beth and I are finished talking. So I'm going to pass it back over to Beth to finish what she was saying, and then we'll go over a few more logistics.
Okay, everyone, I apologize for that. So I'm Beth. I am the Copework intern, and we are going to do a webinar today presented by Dr. Shatra Liker. She is an adult adoptee, adoptive parent, and psychologist who specializes in trauma with her private practice out of South Denver, known as Beyond Words Psychological Services. She was adopted as an infant from India, and she understands the joys and challenges adoptees can face firsthand. She is also an adoptive parent of a son from Ethiopia and recognizes the necessity for educating adoptive parents so they can be genuine and effective in support to their children. She educates on the topic of how to talk to children about adoption, difficult birth histories, trauma-informed parenting, racial and cultural identity within multiracial families, and she provides pre- and post-adoption services in the areas of counseling, coaching, and assessment. So please join us with Dr. Shatra Liker today in the webinar Through the Years, what an adoptee, adoptive parent, and psychologist has learned and wants to teach you. Thank you.
Great. So before we hand it over to Shatra, we're just going to go over a few logistical things. And everybody, welcome. We're really excited to have you here today. Shatra's amazing, as you'll find out. So if you're joining us by the internet, please notice that you'll see a help button with a question mark. So if you are having internet difficulties or some technical difficulties, you can either click on that help button or you can send a message to us. Any message that is sent to Beth or I are private, so the whole group won't see them. And then you can also text me if you are having any other problems and you can't get on the internet. And so I'm going to give you just a minute to grab a pen or pencil, and then I'm going to give you my cell phone number, and you can write that down and text. So the number that you can call is 970-250-0034. Again, that's 970-250-0034. And if you have noticed that our audio is separate from the internet, so I would say make sure that you stay on the phone because that's the only way that you're going to be able to hear us today. If you have any other questions, yeah, shoot it in the chat box or a text. And we are also recording this, as you heard the audio say that we're recording. So this will also be available at a later time for people to hear again, or if you have any friends or family members that would like to hear what Shatra has to say today. So thank you again and welcome, and we're going to hand it over to Shatra.
Hi there. All right, can everyone hear me? I want to make sure I'm not muted.
Yeah, if everybody could just type in their box that you can hear Shatra, that would be great so we can see that.
Okay. All right. Do we seem to be all good?
Yes, I think so. Okay. It looks like you can. Somebody can't hear us, but I'll address that in the chat box.
Okay.
All right.
All right. Well, hi, welcome. I am Dr. Shatra Liker, and I appreciate the introduction, Beth and Tara. So as I mentioned, I'm an adoptee from India and an adoptive parent to a son from Ethiopia. And then in my practice as a psychologist, I specialize in trauma and adoption work with people of all ages, and a lot of times families with children and teens. So today my hope is just to share some of the things that I've learned through not only my clinical work, but personal experiences as an adoptee and a parent, just to give you more ideas and more insights into how you can better support your kids, and some of the typical challenges that you're likely to face as an adoptive parent. So what we'll be doing is I'll be speaking for a while, and then at the very end you'll be able to enter in your questions into the chat box, and from there I'll be able to respond to as many of those as possible. If we run out of time today, I believe that Tara and Beth will be including my email address so that you can go ahead and email your questions to me as well, and I'm happy to respond. So to tell you a little bit more about my background, I was adopted from India as an infant back in the days before parents traveled to other countries to bring their kids home. So I actually arrived in the U.S. when I was about 8 weeks old in a basket with 3 other babies. We were escorted here. So it cracks me up whenever I share that story with some of my clients. And I had a 5-year-old once, and I go, in a basket with other babies, weren't you squished? And I had never thought about that part of my story before, but his words made me actually think about, I wonder what the comfort level was like being in that basket with 3 other babies on this long plane ride. So it's funny, all the things that we start thinking about as we get older as adoptees, and how our stories kind of change in meaning. And then I grew up in a family. I had 2 parents who are white, and then a brother who was also adopted from India 5 years later. He is not biologically related to me. But I grew up, and my parents early on always talked about adoption. I knew I was adopted from very early on, and obviously I was going to figure it out at some point. But they were very good about that piece of it. But then as I grew older, we never really talked about some of the other things that were coming up, what it was like to think about birth parents, or what it was like to answer other people's adoption questions. It was just kind of something that I think they thought we were all comfortable with because we knew we were adopted. And so it's one of those things where I feel like communication is key. And so it's really my goal to teach prospective adoptive parents and adoptive parents about the best ways that they can support their children and how they can communicate with them through those tough times. It's become even more important to me now that I'm a parent. My son is 3.5. He's adopted from Ethiopia, and it's been a very interesting process to now kind of look at my adoption through a different lens after going through his adoption process, and kind of seeing it from the other end, and being able to think more about what it might have been like for me through seeing how everything has happened for him. So I know that many adoptees, that's the stage in life when they become parents, whether biological or step or adoptive, but it's a time when they really process their own adoption story as well. And then lastly, with my practice as a psychologist, I do a lot of work with adoptees, not only the grief and loss and the trauma piece, but just what does it mean to build your identity around being an adoptee, and what are the things that you need to share and just sort of get off your chest with somebody who understands. So it's been something where I've been in the mental health field for about 13 years now, and a lot of that has been working with adoptees and foster children. So I feel very, very fortunate to be able to work with this population, because I think it's been a great fit. So to get started, today we're going to cover things that, I could probably talk to you about for a whole weekend, but I'm going to squeeze it into an hour, and we will leave that time at the end for questions as well. But kind of today I just want to talk about some of the common challenges that are going to come up, and some of the experiences I've had with those, and how I see you best supporting your children. So to start off, adoption is complex. It sounds like an understatement, but it's so true, and so often we forget that. A lot of times adoption is viewed as this sort of, it's a solution. It's a happy solution to a problem. You're giving a child who needs a family, and a family who wants a child then is getting a child. And in many ways that is a really beautiful, wonderful thing, and I certainly love my family. I wouldn't trade them for anything. But at the same time, all stories are unique, And certainly every adoptee story is unique, but there's one universal chapter in that story, and that's loss. And there can't be adoption without loss. And so the parts that loss brings up are usually the parts that lead to the challenge. The best way I ever heard adoption described is that it's a funeral, a marriage, and a birthday all rolled into one. And that just really resonated for me because it describes the complexity of emotions that go into being adopted, all of the aspects of it that come crashing together. And to imagine what it would be like to go through all three of those things in one day, to go through your marriage, your birthday, and funeral all in one day, or even to go to someone else's, and how emotionally exhausting that would be, and what it would be like to try and reconcile all of those feelings. And then imagine being a child trying to do that, or trying to do that on a daily basis, or every time you go through an anniversary date related to your adoption. I mean, it really does get to the core of how exhausting that can be to deal with those emotions and try and make sense of it all. So, just briefly to talk about a child's understanding of adoption developmentally, and certainly this is different for every child just based on their functioning and where they're at with their understanding, but overall, around up to age 3 years old, children are sort of just parroting what they've heard about adoption. They're not really understanding what it means. And certainly I can say that's true for my son now, being 3.5. He'll share his adoption story, and he'll want to look through the pictures in his adoption book, but he still doesn't fully understand what it means. He's starting to get to that point of, just having celebrated Mother's Day. We always light a candle for our first mothers, and so learning about his Ethiopian mommy and my Indian mommy and trying to make sense of some of that. So we're getting very close to the question about where babies come from. So that'll be a fun time. We can even talk a little bit more about how to answer some of those kinds of questions too. But overall, at that age, they don't really understand what adoption means. And then when you get to around 4 to 6 years old is when kids are really starting to understand the differences. They're recognizing there's something different about my family, and whether it's just that the family, obvious reasons, if it's a transracial adoption and they look different from everyone else in their family because of their skin color, or if there are the other things that come up, just not having blue eyes like everyone else in the family, or recognizing that they don't have the baby pictures that other people in the family had. And certainly if they're older adoptees, those are things that they're going to be very aware of too. They're going to recognize all those changes that occurred. And it is around that age, around 3 to 4 years old, that my mom shares a story of how I asked her, when is my skin going to turn white like yours? And she said she was just kind of shocked. She doesn't even remember what her response was, because we had talked so much about adoption, she hadn't even thought about the skin color aspect. As an adult, our logic says, okay, well, that falls under the umbrella of adoption. But as a child, I didn't understand that adoption and our differences in skin color had anything to do with each other. And as an adult now, something I've really come to recognize is that when you take a child who isn't old enough to remember any part of their adoption, about being with a first family or foster families or an orphanage, as soon as you then bring them into your family, everything in their life has changed, absolutely everything. So why not their skin color too? At that age, they don't necessarily understand that it's permanent. So some of those kinds of things, recognizing those differences, it just tends to bring up a lot of questions. And then when you get to about 7 to 11 years old is when kids are really starting to understand the gains and the losses that are associated with adoption, but they're still not understanding the why. And certainly even as an adult, the why of it is so complex for me to fully grasp. And so to expect a child to understand that isn't really fair. So all those questions that are coming up around that age are so important for them to start piecing their story together and understanding what their adoption narrative is and what it means to them. And, then in the teen years is, kids are more mature at that age. They're starting to ask more insightful questions, and they're reflecting on their adoption experience, and and they're understanding what it means on a very complex level. And at the same time, the teen years are a time when most kids want to avoid any talk about adoption. They want to deny that they're adopted. They don't want to think about it at all because, I mean, let's be honest, teenagers, they just want to be like everybody else, right? They just want to be quote-unquote normal, just fit in with their friends. They don't want to think about how they're different because identity at that age is so much about being similar to everyone else around you, similar to your peers. And so, it's a little bit of an ironic stage because they're trying to find their identity, but they're often denying a big part of it as well, the adoption piece. I would say that the majority of my clients come to me around that age of 5 to 7 years old, just because that is the time when their understanding of the differences and what adoption means is really just growing exponentially, and they're trying to make sense of it. So, expect kind of those ages I mentioned, around 4 to 6, and then around 7 to 11, and then the teen years, that those stages are going to kind of bring up new questions or new ideas in the way that your child talks about their adoption story and wants to ask questions of you. So I think it's really important for us to talk about, as we're talking about developmental stages in life, because certainly the understanding that adoptees have about adoption is fluid. It's ever-changing, and I can say that for myself as well. I mean, I do this work every day, and I live as an adoptee every day and as an adoptive parent every day, and still I'm constantly learning and growing, and my understanding is changing. And so I think it's important to talk about the 7 core issues that most adoptees will face, just related to that initial loss. And so that first issue is loss. And when we talk about loss, it's not only the typical things we think of a child losing the first family, the people that were in their lives, or the places or the things, but oftentimes we forget that a child's first environment is the womb. And so that experience of being in the womb and having that environment, all of the sensory experiences and movements and emotions that go along with that, even if a child comes to you at birth, that they're still experiencing a loss. And oftentimes we forget about those sensory or implicit memories that are coming out for them and can be triggered later on. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later too, but that loss is the first really big core issue. And then the second one is rejection. So rejection, when you think about, oftentimes people will say adoption is trauma, and I personally don't believe that's a true statement. I feel like trauma comes when a child is separated from their first mother at whatever stage that might be in, because that separation isn't typical. It's not something that's normal for people. So it is going to have some residual effects, and certainly some kids are able to be more resilient with that than others. But that idea of not being able to stay with their first mother is often a sense of not being good enough, even if on some level they recognize, I was a baby, I had no control, I couldn't do anything. There's still a part of them that wishes they could have had control, that they could have had a say in it. And so that rejection piece can be very strong, and that tends to be the piece that I see most often in adoptees as they grow older, is the sense of not being good enough. And oftentimes I see that manifesting in one of two ways, either that they become very big people pleasers and overachievers, and they're striving to be good enough, to show everyone and to prove that worth, or they're sort of on the other end of the spectrum and they're saying, why even try? They're self-sabotaging, and they're destroying their relationships and property and everything that they can think of, because they're thinking, why bother? I'm never going to be good enough, so why try? I might as well just live into this idea of being a bad one. So those two ends of the spectrum tend to come out pretty often, just based on that sense of not being good enough because of that first belief of rejection. The third issue tends to be around guilt and shame. And there's often guilt around deservingness. I experienced this very strongly when we went to Ethiopia to meet my son and seeing some of the other children in the orphanage who had not yet been placed with families. And I remember it hitting me like a ton of bricks, this sense of, why me? Why did I deserve a family any more than any of these other kids? And the truth is I didn't. That's where the good fortune came in, that I happened to be somebody who got to be placed with a family. But that sense of guilt tends to be very strong in a lot of adoptees because there's this belief, again, of having to live up to something. I didn't necessarily deserve this. I was lucky to get it, so I have to do everything I can to feel like I can deserve it. And the shame piece then comes along with that. Why am I getting these things that other kids may not have gotten? Or even shame around differences. Our society, while the media is getting much better about how it portrays families, and especially non-traditional families, there's still this belief in sort of the nuclear family who are all white and who are all similar looking to each other. And that idea permeates much of what we see. And so even if you are doing a great job of showing your child what non-traditional families look like just in their daily lives and the relationships that are significant to your family, they're still getting these messages that make it hard to ignore, that they are different in some way. And so, when I think about that, I think of even when I was a teenager, my family moved to a different state. And, when early on in elementary school, everyone knew I was adopted. It was something that was learned pretty early on. And my mom was a room mother in the classroom setting. And so people just got used to the fact that I didn't look like my parents. It wasn't really a question anymore. And then when I started 8th grade, my family moved to Colorado. And at that time, I started making new friends, but it was this whole new experience of having to explain my adoption. And I'll never forget this time when a friend, I'll say so-called friend, came to visit my home for the first time, and she saw my parents, who, as I mentioned, are both white, and she goes, "Wow, you don't look anything like your parents." And at first I thought she was joking because I thought, well, obviously I don't. And then when I realized she was serious, I remember, being my kind of teenager sassy self, thinking like, what a moron. Obviously she's very sheltered, never heard of adoption before. But then her reaction to it is what really hit me, because she started just kind of falling over herself going, "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry you're adopted. I didn't know you were adopted. I'm so sorry." And for the first time in my life, I felt like this wave of shame passed through me about being adopted, where I felt like, what, maybe there is something wrong with it. Maybe I should be ashamed of it, because she was just so genuinely sorry for me. And again, because it wasn't something that my parents and I had talked about as being someone's possible reaction to adoption, I didn't feel prepared to handle it. I didn't know what to say or how to respond. And so those kinds of situations, I feel like, are the most dangerous ones, where kids haven't been prepared by the people who love them and can guide them through it in a positive way. So we'll talk a little bit more about how to do that later. So kind of moving on from there, the fourth core issue is grief. And so for obvious reasons, all of those losses that have occurred, and at the same time, the losses that are still happening, with a lot of adoptees feeling like they don't fully belong in their family or in the community or in that world that they're in. And it's oftentimes, this is where I tell parents, this is why it's so important for adoptive families to have strong connections with other adopted families. Your adoptive children need to be friends with other adoptees. And that's not to say that, just because it looks good on paper, if you have two kids who are, the same race and adopted from similar situations or the same country, certainly it doesn't mean their personalities are automatically going to click. But the more opportunities you can provide for your child to get to know other adoptees, the better off they're going to be. I wasn't around a lot of other adoptees growing up, and I just know that as an adult, when I became connected with the adoptee community, what an amazing experience that was, because suddenly I had people who really understood. They got it. They understood the questions that come up when you're adopted. They understood what it felt like to not fully belong in either place. For me, feeling not fully American and not fully Indian, sort of somewhere in between. Those are the kind of things where those unspoken bonds come up, and they're so important for adoptees in building a strong identity. So, I mean, when it comes to that sense of belonging, your adoption is a culture within itself. So your child needs to be a part of that culture, or at least have the opportunity to be a part of it. And again, the teen years being a time when they'll probably try to avoid that a little bit more. But as long as you stay connected, that opportunity will always be there for them when they're ready. And college age is usually when they come back to wanting to understand that part of their identity. The other part of grief is that it's something I call a ghost life, that most adoptees, a lot of us can look at an experience and go, okay, we could have made choice A or choice B, and I wonder how different that experience would have been for us if we had chosen B over A. But when it comes to adoption, that whole sense of what our lives could have been like and how different they could have been, I mean, there's this ghost life that's being lived by the part of us that stayed with our birth parents, however that situation may have looked. And it's a very real, concrete feeling for adoptees trying to understand these two parts of themselves, these two potential identities that have been developing over time. So the next issue is then identity, that issue of how do we know who we are if we're not fully sure where we've come from, or if we're not okay with where we've come from. If it's a very traumatic history, how do you find a way to reconcile that with still feeling like you're a good and worthy person if you've come from a place where people have been very hurtful or very abusive. So that identity piece sort of is the umbrella over everything, and it really has to come from a place of understanding what that narrative is for your child at any given moment around their story. The sixth core issue for adoptees is intimacy. And I think a lot of times that's one of the ones we focus on more. We understand that a lot of times kids who have been adopted, regardless of their age or circumstances, are more likely to have difficulties with bonding and attachment and trust and feeling safe. And this is one of those things, again, that I feel very strongly about, the idea that instead of labeling kids or giving a diagnosis, that it's so important to recognize that they oftentimes are having normal reactions to abnormal events that have happened in their life. And so I often look at it the same way as, if we take a woman who's been through a domestic violence situation, and instead of labeling her, when she gets out of that relationship and doesn't want to jump back into another relationship or has trouble with that, we wouldn't label her with, say, like reactive attachment disorder. We would say, well, that's understandable. She's taking her time learning to trust and feel safe and trust her own judgment. And so I think we need to give that same frame of mind, when we're talking about children who have gone through these huge losses and huge transitions so early in life. The way that we decide to label them, or at least to understand the context of what they're going through. So really, I mean, that intimacy is not only related to the trust and the safety, but it's about that closeness being scary because it can bring up rejection again. And if I let you in, are you going to reject me the same way that my first family did? It brings up the sense of not being good enough again. Am I deserving of a positive relationship? And, something that a lot of times non-adoptees don't think about this, but for many adoptees, a huge fear, if they don't know the identity of their birth family, is that if they get into a relationship, they're going to find out that they are biologically related to their partner. And that's a very real fear for many adoptees, and especially for those who have been adopted domestically. So it's really something to consider, especially as your child ages and starts to date, and if they're wanting to do DNA testing or that type of thing, just to feel a bit more confident about who they are and where they've come from and what connections they may have. The final issue is control. So essentially it comes down to early on, having to leave your first family, again, regardless of the circumstances, and be placed with another family, that is the ultimate lack of control for a child, regardless of their age. And so this idea of not having control over something so significant early on leads to a sense of wanting control with everything later. And that tends to be a very big thing that I see with adoptees, and often many of the clients that I see coming in. So much of the behavior, it comes down to two things. It comes down to control and safety. And so as parents, the thing that you can do most for them is to give them options for control, to give them options to feel safe. And oftentimes that's going to be more about connected parenting and things like trust-based relational intervention, TBRI, and focusing on some of those ideas around Karen Purvis's model of TBRI, or focusing on Dan Siegel's work around how to interact with a child to maintain that relationship and that trust, so that they feel safe enough to allow you to have some of that control. And I wish we had time to go into more of that today, but just keeping those things in mind and being able to look back at this recording later to be able to look through some of those materials if you haven't already. So really, I think something important to mention when it comes to those 7 core issues, and I'll list them again: loss, rejection, guilt and shame, grief, identity, intimacy, and control. Those things are not necessarily there in every adoptee's life at every moment, but they can be. And the time that they seem to come up the most is around birthdays and around anniversaries of the adoption or experiences related to the adoption. So those, a lot of times we don't necessarily know what the trigger is for a behavior, but we can recognize the patterns of the timing. And that at least gives us a sense, as much as we can find out about our child's history, the easier it's going to be to understand. Because, as I mentioned earlier, it's not only the explicit memories, the memories they have throughout their life as they start to kind of organize their story, but the implicit memories, that pre-verbal time and that time in the womb, there can be triggers there, and we just may not ever fully know what they are, be able to pinpoint them. But as long as we can understand some of the patterns, or certain seasons or times have an effect on our child in a negative way, then at least we have some understanding of when they're coming, so we can act in a more preventative and proactive way to help them and support them. So, when it comes to those 7 core issues and all of those things that come up around adoption, I think oftentimes that's compounded by kids who have very difficult birth stories. When there are situations involving mental illness or rape or incest, or parents who have abused drugs or were incarcerated, children who are abandoned. All of those things that as parents, they break our heart to think that our kids went through that. It's not about us as parents. It's about your child having the right to know their story, because that's how they're going to start to make sense of a lot of those triggers for themselves. I mentioned birthdays, and I had a very difficult time with birthdays, usually in that month or couple weeks leading up to it, and then the day of, and then afterwards it was fine, but I would get very sensitive to rejection. Somebody as a kid wasn't going to come to my birthday party. I would get very depressed, and it was something that I didn't really recognize the pattern until I was an adult. I realized, I kind of try and isolate her on my birthday, and now I have a better understanding of why the more I've dug into my own story. And just having that understanding and that little bit of information, it's not necessarily that it causes trauma for me, it's that it causes relief, because I'm not crazy. I have a reason for it. And that self-doubt in adoptees tends to be a big part of why they may not fully understand those patterns. But if you can help them make those connections, or at least help them recognize that the patterns are occurring, it's going to help them make sense of it later on, so that they can manage it better on their own. So, when it comes to those difficult birth stories, I always say, if your child's asking, they're ready to know the answer. And not only that, but if they're asking, there's a part of them that probably already knows on some level, and a lot of times there often is that implicit understanding. And if they don't fully understand it, at least there's probably going to be something that clicks for them. And that's not to say that you're going to sit down and tell your 4 or 5-year-old about a very difficult birth story involving rape or incest, but it's to say that as they get older and they start to ask questions, that you're honest with them about what you know. Because trying to protect them from their story is only going to lead to a rift in the trust that they have with you as a parent later on, and it's going to damage attachment later on. So it's about answering the questions as they come up, but being very careful to only answer the question that they're asking. And that's a pitfall that I see parents fall into quite often. And I always think of this story in one of those Chicken Soup for the Soul books. I remember reading it, and it was a story about a mother who was in a doctor's waiting room with her 6-year-old little girl. And the little girl's kind of looking through the forms as mom fills them out, and she goes, "Hey, Mom, what's sex?" And everybody in the waiting room, of course, is like record scratch right there, ready to go, whoa, what's Mom going to say? And instead of going with the adult logic around that question, Mom says, "Well, what do you mean?" And the little girl says, "Oh, on this form it says M or F for sex." And so the way that Mom answered that question is very different than what we might have thought her answer would be if she hadn't clarified. And so I strongly, strongly encourage parents to clarify what their child is asking if it has an ambiguous meaning. And even if you don't think it does, but you just need to get in the habit of making sure that developmentally you're understanding where your child's understanding is at, making sure that, well, tell me more about what you mean by that, or tell me more about what you're asking, and what kind of answer are you looking for? Asking those clarifying questions to help them be clear about what they want to know, so that you don't get into a situation where you're over-explaining and in over your head and suddenly having to explain things that your child has no way of grasping what they mean. So really being clear about where they're at developmentally and letting their questions lead you with those difficult birth stories. And then, really, too, it's not about, a lot of times we want to protect our kids. We don't want them to hurt because of their story or situations that have happened to them. And so we're trying to protect them or reassure them that it's all okay. But the truth is, the hardest thing about being an adoptive parent is you can't make it better. If they have a hard story, it's their hard story, and they need to own it. So it's not about reassuring and comforting. A lot of the time, it's just about listening and sitting with them and the hard emotions and the unfairness of it. Because if you're trying to make it better, the message you're sending to them is that their discomfort is too hard for you to handle, and then they're not going to feel comfortable sharing with you. So I always use this quote in almost all of my workshops by Mr. Rogers, right? Who knows kids better than Mr. Rogers? So he once said, "What's mentionable is manageable." And I think that is the key to all communication for adoptive parents, for any parent, for any relationship. As long as something is mentionable, it's something you can work through. It's when you can't even talk about it because it's too uncomfortable or difficult that suddenly it has power over you and it feels too overwhelming to handle. So be able to talk about those difficult things, be able to say, "I don't know," if that's the honest response, to be honest about your child's story, not to try and just make it okay, but to sit with them in the hard parts and recognize that it's unfair. Those are the things that are going to bring that connection and really make the challenges easier to get through. So on that, I know we have just a couple minutes here left. I want to just check in about one thing. So one of the other big difficult challenges that families face is the questions that they get from other people about adoption. And so I, as a kid, that's not something my parents and I practiced, how to respond when someone says, "Why are you adopted?" or "Why don't you look like your parents?" or "Do you know your first parents?" or often they would say, "Your real parents." And I didn't know how to respond. I remember feeling like a deer in headlights. And so one of the things that I've really focused on with younger adoptees especially is helping them feel empowered around their adoption story and how to answer those questions. And as a parent, one of the best things you can do is make it fun. Make it something where they feel in control and feel like they're in charge of it. So even something like on the refrigerator, starting a list that says, you know you're adopted when, and lists all of the crazy or funny or weird things that people ask you in your family or that they say about adoption, because then you can start to practice your responses. You can role play at home and make it fun. But the options for responding, I actually created a workbook for kids around that, because I didn't want kids to go through that deer in headlights feel that I had, where especially if it was an adult, I felt like I had to answer, and I didn't recognize that I was allowed to have some privacy. So I created a workbook for kids around how to respond with 6 different options to kind of fit different personality styles. Since we won't have a lot of time to talk about it here, I'll hold it up for you. So this workbook is for sale on my website. It's the Empowered Ways to Respond to Adoption Questions workbook, and it's great for elementary age kids to go through and learn about different ways to respond, and then to be able to practice those. There are some items in the book where they can do activities and start practicing, and then it gives you an opening for conversation. But ultimately, what this all comes down to with adoption is that you need to be able to talk with your kids about whatever they're feeling and make it about them, to be able to do your own therapeutic work if you need to, if there are things triggering you around their story, which is really likely to happen if they have a difficult story or if they're struggling a lot. But just to make sure that you feel comfortable and confident being able to talk to them. And even if you don't feel confident, just knowing that it's okay to struggle through those awkward conversations as long as you're doing it together. So just remember, what's mentionable is manageable. And like I say, I could talk about all of this forever, but I do want to make sure that we have time for everyone's questions. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to questions in the chat box now, and I'll start working on answering those. I thank you so much for coming today and for listening, and hopefully gaining some more insight around how you can better support your kids. Feel free to visit my website at growbeyondwords.com. That's GROW, beyondwords.com. And there you'll find more information about my services, where you can order the workbook, the Empowered Workbook, and then also links to 3 more videos I have for parents on adoption-related topics. Those include video for parents related to the Empowered Ways to Respond to Adoption Questions that accompanies the workbook, one related to managing trauma-reactive behaviors in your kids, and then one on talking about race and racism with your transracial adoptee to build a positive racial identity. So feel free to check out those resources as well, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
And at this point, everybody can type in a question for Chaitra in the chat box if you have anything specific for her at this time.
Quiet group. Questions are coming. Tara, thank you for including the correct email address in the chat box, too.
You're welcome, and we have a couple questions coming in. We're sending them to you right now.
Okay, great. First question, do I do EMDR? Yes, I do. I find that, especially for those implicit sensory memories we talked about, where it's pre-verbal and there aren't really the words to go along with a trauma or an experience, EMDR can be very useful. And a lot of times I'll combine EMDR with play therapy or with family therapy and sort of parent coaching. And then as far as, just for those who aren't familiar, EMDR is eye movement desensitization reprocessing. It's a specialized form of trauma therapy. But yes, I do EMDR. Okay, so another quick question. No, I do not seek Medicaid, mostly for that reason I mentioned previously about diagnosis. Oftentimes I've really try not to label a child with a diagnosis because there's going to be stigma that follows them, and especially when I feel that their reactions are, normal reactions to abnormal events, and then the privacy issue as well. So I've opted to stop accepting insurance. All right, so there is a question about identity, and it's I'm not sure exactly what, maybe some specifics would help. Identity, as far as being an adoptee, just in general, we all have to take time to develop our identity, and a lot of times this happens quite a bit around early adolescence and then around the college years and then again in midlife, 30s, 40s. And adoption just adds another layer to trying to figure out our identity, because if we don't really fully understand where we've come from or why we've come to be in the family that we're a part of, it makes it really difficult to understand who you are if you're missing a huge gap in your story. It's sort of like floating above the world. There's a little part of you that doesn't fully feel grounded and attached to that identity, and so it's just another layer that makes it more difficult in finding who you are and sort of where you belong and being able to integrate that sense of self. All right. Okay, so another great question. I get this a lot. So wanting to know, with a child adopted at birth, how can you tell when a behavior is developmental versus adoption-related? And really, it's not even necessarily about when they're adopted in their life. Trying to determine whether something is developmental or adoption-related, oftentimes there's not going to be a clear answer. So it really, this person mentioned, would you need the help of a therapist? And most definitely you want to seek an adoption competent therapist to work with you to start determining what some of those differences might be. And a lot of times, like I say, there's not going to be a clear answer, but there may be such as those common core struggles, those 7 struggles that adoptees face. There may be things that a professional is able to identify that may be more adoption related and be able to work with them through an adoption competent approach. And when I say adoption competent, a lot of mental health professionals unfortunately don't recognize what a specific specialty adoption is. So I do have a blog on my website that lists screening questions to ask a mental health professional about adoption competent things. So being able to recognize whether they actually truly are aware of adoption-related struggles and how to manage those effectively in treatment, or if that's maybe not an area where they would be most competent. So feel free to check out the blog on my website to find those screening questions. Let's see, another question. So do I do workshops on kinship? And I don't have any workshops specifically on kinship adoption, but I do a lot of live workshops on various adoption topics, and they all sort of pull in the different types of adoption. So everything from international to domestic to foster care, kinship, step, all of those ways that families come together. And a lot of times it's more related to trauma and how you can kind of help your child manage things behaviorally and emotionally, and then ways to help them work through their story and feel empowered around it. Another question, what do you think about reconnecting with birth siblings? I think it's important. Sibling connections, oftentimes adoptees, even adoptees of a young age, I hear this so often from parents that they'll talk about how their child is, 4 or 5 years old, and they keep talking about, I wish I had an older brother, and they're not really sure where it's coming from. And then later in life, they'll find out, oh, yeah, my child actually had a birth sibling, an older brother. And so, again, there are those implicit memories and those things that inherently adoptees seem to understand on some level. But when it comes to birth siblings, I do think it's so important for adoptees to have those connections whenever possible, whenever it's safe, because those are the congregants that, again, are going to help them fill in those gaps in their story and help them build their identity in a way that feels more cohesive and congruent with what they may feel internally. All right. Let's see. Looks like that the last question for now. Just make sure. Okay. There's another question about Medicaid. I don't know if someone missed that, but I don't accept Medicaid right now. All right. Okay, another question. So what specific issues should we be prepared for with a kinship adoption, which they hope to keep contact with the biological father and the kids want to be with him instead of us? These are tween-age boys. So really, you just want to be, again, prepared to sit with them in the unfairness of it. And a lot of times what that can look like is, you know, if they're saying, and I hate you and I wish I could live with my dad and I'm just so mad at you and it's not fair, instead of going, well, you can't live with your dad because of A, B, and C and he's not safe to be with, and you know, we're letting you see him and visit with him, and instead of trying to explain all the facts, just sit with them in the emotions of it. Sit with them and be able to say, you're right. It's not fair. You can feel mad at me if you need to because I know the situation is not fair and you have a lot of big feelings about it, and that's okay. I'm going to stay here with you while you feel that. And you know what? It's not fair and it sucks, and I'm really sorry that you have to go through this. And you know what? I wish you could be with your dad too. I wish that was a possibility. I wish that for you. You know, if you can wish with the kids and these fantasies and these things that they're hoping for, that's going to connect you so much further than if you were to just give them facts about why something can't be. It's so important for kids to feel like you understand where they're at and that you understand the unfairness of it, because it's not fair and it's not something they had control over. It's not something that many people have control over in that situation. It's a series of events that happen. So it's more about just being able to sit with them in the hard parts of it and reflect on that with them. All right, that'll be the last question for today. So,
Just with the questions, Chaitra.
Okay.
Yeah. Actually, there is a quick question. Is there a transcript available for the talk that you just provided? But also, keeping in mind that this will be available for video, that anybody is able to watch this afterwards. In the upcoming weeks, we'll post it on our website so people can watch this again, or send a link to a friend or a family member that could benefit from the training too. But I guess to answer their question, Chaitra, do you have a transcript?
No, I don't have a transcript of this. But I will go ahead and once the link is up on the Adoption Exchange's website for the recording of the video, I'll be sure to post a link to that on my website as well, just so that there is even more access to it.
Yes, and we'll also be emailing all the participants today the link as well, but it may not be up for a few weeks, so everybody
be patient.
Yeah, be patient with that. Okay, do you have anything else that you'd like to add, Chaitra, before I go over if anybody would like a certificate of completion or an upcoming training in July?
I just really want to say thank you. I think the parents who are willing to come in the middle of the day and listen and be a part of this, you're already on the right track. You're doing what you need to do to learn as much as you can, get all the tools you can for your parenting toolbox, and be able to support your child with whatever challenges come up. So I applaud you for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Chaitra. We're honored to have you and to provide this webinar for everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
And great.
Thank you to Tara and to Beth for setting this up, too. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. And such great insight, too, with your background. I mean, you definitely have, like, a perspective that not many people have, so that's really appreciated. So when everybody hangs up, there'll be a survey that pops up. Please fill that out, because that helps us in knowing which presentations and to provide in the future. And then if you are interested in an hour certificate for attending today, please email me at tscabella@adoptx.org. It was also provided in the chat box, and Beth is going to type it again one more time. It's just my name, T for Tara, scubella@adoptx.org. Or you can even text me, that's okay, at 970-250-0034, and I just need to know the name that you would like on the certificate, and then I will email it back to you. So if you're texting it to me, please provide your email address as well, and I will get that to you. It'll probably be by the end of this week, so if you don't see it today or tomorrow, please know you may end up getting it on Friday. And then the Adopt Care, we have an Adopt Care Advanced training coming up in July for professionals and for parents. We ask that you have either attended the Adopt Care regular training or you can watch it for free online. There's a link on our website, and you can attend that video for free, and then when you register for the Adopt Care Advanced, you can mention that you've already attended it in the past. And if you're a professional, if you've been in the field for, I think it's a minimum of 5 years, you don't need to attend the Adopt Care regular training. And that is for 4 weeks. It'll be the 8th through the 29th of July, every Friday between 10 and noon. And registration will be available in the next couple of weeks for that. So be looking for that registration in our community emails and on our Facebook page. So thank you, everybody, for attending, and we'll keep the website up just for a couple more minutes if you'd like to write down my email address or phone number. And thanks again.